The following podcast contains mature themes and is intended for an adult audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to this episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, we continue our conversation around why fornication, simple fornication as St. Thomas calls it, is such a serious sin. Now, to understand why he uses the term simple fornication and to understand the rationale where he explains why a child needs both the father and the mother to be present for him to become who he or she is meant to be, it would be a very good idea to listen to the previous episode, because in that episode is where we went to, at depth, we discussed what the father brings into the whole picture in a child's upbringing and versus what the mother contributes. So that's an important background, but we shall continue from there. Picking up from the sentence in the article, in the body of the article, the technical term for it is sed contra, the I answer that. So we're in the I answer that section, where St. Thomas says, now it is evident that the upbringing of a human child requires not only the mother's care for his nourishment, but much more the care of his father as guide and guardian, and under whom he progresses in goods, both internal and external. Carrying on from there, hence human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate, specific woman and should abide with her a long time or even for a whole lifetime. Building on the idea we spoke about in the previous episode, the difference between schooling and education, that education is needed. Education happens throughout the lifetime of a human being. Schooling, the learning of certain basic skills, is usually happens within the first 2 decades of a person's life. Education happens throughout one's life. That's the difference between schooling and education. And because education is far more important than schooling. Look, schooling is a key foundation, right? But a person can do away with certain aspects of schooling and not be none the worse for it, because his or her education will make up for it. However, you cannot do away with education, because education is what actually determines your value as a human being. And if you're a Christian and have a Christian worldview, your education actually is what's going to determine your eternal salvation or your eternal perdition. Whether you have been educated in the virtues, most importantly of which are faith, hope, and love, and then all the other human virtues after that. So education is in that sense far more important, far more significant, far more impactful than simple schooling. Now, because it takes place across one's entire life, and because a father is needed for one's education, for one to become who one is supposed to be, and education takes place over a long time, it therefore makes sense that you need the father figure to be around for as long as possible, That's why St. Thomas says, hence human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate woman and should abide with her a long time or even for a whole lifetime. Because a long time or a whole lifetime is the amount of period that's needed for a human being to achieve true maturity, which is the result of education. Hence, it is that in the human race, the male has a natural solicitude for the certainty of offspring, because on him devolves the upbringing of the children, and this certainty would cease if the union of sexes were indeterminate. Let's unpack that statement. So he starts by saying hence, meaning that this is a consequence of what he said earlier. What he said earlier was that that human nature rebels against males and females, men and women, coupling or forming children just randomly, like just at random, without even any arrangement, any structures, any family being formed. Actually, that's what. So he's drawing from that. He says, this is why in the human race, the male has a natural solicitude. When St. Thomas uses the word solicitude, he means care or concern, maybe even obsession, right? Hence, the male has a natural care or concern for the certainty of offspring. In other words, in the human race, amongst human beings, naturally, because deep down inside, we know that the way in which we mate and form children should not be random. This is why men have a kind of deep concern to always know or ascertain whether this child is mine or not, because it points towards the fact that deep down in our nature, as a man, you know that you're responsible for that child's upbringing and protection and making sure that they benefit from goods both internal and external, to use the words which St. Thomas had quoted earlier. So as a result of that, that is why human beings, men, always want to know, is this my child or not? That is what St. Thomas says when he says, hence it is that in the human race, at a natural level, the male has a natural solicitude or care for the certainty or for the making sure that this offspring belongs to him, because on him devolves the upbringing of the child, and this certainty would cease if the union of sexes were indeterminate. Now you could argue, I can hear the arguments coming that, yeah, but I know this guy who, fathered this kid and wanted nothing to do with the kid and denied the kid and said the child isn't his, etc., etc. Yeah, there are those cases. But there are also, and maybe that's the stuff that's sensational. That's the stuff that makes it to the news and trends on social media and makes it into, living rooms and houses where people are gossiping, right? Water cooler gossip. Okay, cool. That's what people will talk about. But people don't speak that much about, those same fathers who 10, 20, 30 years later, there's this thing that wells up within them where they want to know their daughter, they want to know their son, they want to reach out to them, they want to form a relationship. That thing, it's so common. We don't talk about it because it's not sensational, it's not viral, it's not something you're going to share, it's not something you're going to gossip about. So it doesn't make it into your feed, right? But it's there, and it's a deep, deep human need, because deep down in ourselves as men, we know that offspring of mine, that daughter or that son, I am supposed to look after them. I'm supposed to protect them. I'm supposed to provide for them. I'm supposed to form a relationship with them and guide them and guard them for as long as I'm alive on this planet. So that thing, you can beat it down, you can try and ignore it, you can try and argue yourself out of it, talk yourself out of it, but it's there. And as those famous words in Jurassic Park, nature always finds a way. You cannot beat down nature. It will always find a way. Carrying on. This union with a certain definite woman is called matrimony, which for the above reason is said to belong to the natural law. Since, however, the union of the sexes is directed to the common good of the whole human race, and common goods depend on the law for their determination, as stated above, it follows that this union of man and woman, which is called matrimony, is determined by some law. What this determination is for us will be stated in the third part of this work, where we shall treat of the sacrament of matrimony. What really impressed me about this was that St. Thomas, by the time he was writing part 1 of the Summa, had outlined the whole thing, every question, probably every objection, in brief notes, bullet points. I can imagine his manuscripts with all the bullet points of this whole mammoth Herculean work. He had outlined that whole thing. It's such a gift to mankind. I don't think St. Thomas, what a guy. But let's unpack briefly what he said, because what he said before was a bit of a mouthful, right? He said, it's natural within us to want to look after our offspring as men and women, and we know that our offspring needs looking after for a long time. That's why the union between a man and a woman to look after their offspring has to be over a long time. And this natural union, which is over a long time, is called matrimony. Now, then he says, whenever you have something which is in the natural law, which is geared towards the common good of society, like for the whole of society to benefit from something, that thing is protected by a human law. So not just a natural law, but is actually determined by some law. People sit down, write stuff down. And this is why marriage kind of makes this transition from being mere natural law, where two people, and you know how you see this, even when people say, I don't need marriage, I'm just going to live with this woman for the rest of my life. You see that idea of staying with this partner in a stable relationship for the rest of your life? That in itself is like speaking to something of natural law, of people not wanting to just mate indeterminately, but mate with someone who's very specific and form something stable with them for a long time. And that's why St. Thomas says, now this whole thing has to be enshrined in a human law. People sit down and write stuff down in the law and say this is what marriage is, and when you have to get married, you have to go to the court and you have to sign a document and say these two people are married. So it's a law. So that and it's a human law, or these human laws protect natural law, especially when that law is geared towards the common good. This is why it doesn't make sense to speak of two homosexual people, two gay people, two lesbians who come together and say, yeah, we want to be together for the rest of our lives. And so we want the laws to be changed so that we can get married. Look, you can call that a union, call it a partnership, call it civil, whatever you could call it, but do not call it marriage. Why? Because marriage, especially where marriage laws are concerned, have to be geared towards the common good. And we spoke about how homosexual unions are not geared towards the common good, the good of the whole society, in the previous episodes. And if we haven't spoken about it in the previous episodes and I'm getting confused, we shall touch on it in one of the upcoming episodes. So that's why even if homosexual people say, listen, we want to be in a union for the rest of our lives with each other, you can call it many things, but do not call it marriage. And I'm not sure whether the marriage laws should apply to that, because it does not have to do with the common good. So whenever a natural law transitions or is translated into human laws, where people sit down and actually write laws which are enforced by courts and police, etc., it has to be something that affects the common good. How does marriage affect the common good? We've gone to great lengths in this episode and in the previous one to explain how marriage is needed for the education of children, which is a lifelong project. One could argue, hey, but if the union between a homosexual couple or a lesbian or a gay couple, that can be, they can adopt a child and bring the child up and educate the child, and they can be together for the rest of their lives and bring the children up and teach them values and virtues, etc., and make them mature human beings. That's true, but here's the point, which we've been building up little by little. At least one of those people, one of the two women or one of the two men, will know with certainty that offspring is not theirs. So there's a natural thing which you're going against in terms of internally. There's that point which St. Thomas was saying, that in human nature, males have, well, with women, it's obvious. When you give birth to a child, this is my child. I gave birth to this child. There's no confusion about it. But with men, you always have this natural you have this natural desire to want to know, is this child mine? And the reason why you want to know whether this child is yours or not is because deep down inside, you have a responsibility to bring up that child. Now, amongst homosexual couples, at least 50% of the couple is going to be sure that that child is not theirs. And from that will come a consequent reduction of a natural sense of responsibility towards that child. I'm not saying this is always the case. There'll always be an exception here and there, but that's the point. They're exceptions. I generally, and I'm not trying to bash anyone, talk badly about anyone, punch down on anyone, beat down on anyone, badmouth anyone, but I generally don't think that what I just described is the rule. I think it's the exception. That thing of feeling a genuine lifelong responsibility towards someone who is not your child, that thing is an exception. It's not the rule. At least from my observation. Maybe other people have seen differently in their lived experience. And this is what St. Thomas he alludes to. Let's finish reading I answer that, or the said contra, because he builds on this idea of you cannot use the exception as the rule. Carrying on, he says, wherefore, since fornication is an indeterminate union of the sexes as something incompatible with matrimony, it is opposed to the good of the child's upbringing, and consequently it is a mortal sin. He's just, putting a full stop on the long sentence he had been building up before in terms of his argument. He's just recapping the argument. And then he goes on to this point, which is an important point, which is that a man can, impregnate a woman through fornication and then say, listen, I'm going to provide everything for this child. I'll pay their school fees, I'll visit them on weekends, etc., etc. What about that? This is what St. Thomas says. Nor does it matter if a man having knowledge of a woman by fornication make sufficient provision for the upbringing of the child. Because a matter that comes under the determination of the law is judged according to what happens in general and not according to what may happen in a particular case. So, what he's saying is, generally speaking, the fruits of fornication, children who are born out of wedlock, generally speaking, will not have both parents present, just as a general rule. There will be exceptions. You'll have that fantastic guy who says, listen, I want to do the right thing. I want to be there for this child. Maybe you and I can never get married because of all these differences between us, family, I don't know, etc., whatever, personality, whatever it is. But gosh, I'm going to make whatever effort I can make to be there for this child, to educate this child, to provide for this child, to guide and guard this child. You have such human beings. They exist. Thank God they exist. But shucks, they are so few. They are so few. They are the rare exception. And because of that, you cannot make a law based on an exception. You have to make a law based on the general trend, on what generally happens. And also going back to this whole thing of homosexual couples who adopt a child and say, yeah, we'll be together, look after this child or look after these children for the rest of our lives in a stable union, blah, 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 etc. Cool. If they stick together for, the 30, 40, 50 years that's needed for that long haul, that is an exception. It's not a rule. Now, someone would come and say, yeah, but the rate of divorce amongst like heterosexual couples is incredible. Like in South Africa, it's like 50% or whatever. Well, if you look at the rate of divorce of homosexual couples, it's like, last I heard, it was like something like 75%. It's like, 25% more like than heterosexual couples. I mean, that's not like, a small margin. That's a big margin. So yeah, one always has to take into account, always has to take into account those things, which is why, in fact, if you were to look at divorce rates amongst heterosexual couples being so high and just increasing and increasing across the world, that's the sense I get. I could be wrong. I would say the government's primary role is to do whatever it takes to make sure that after people get married, they stick together. So I don't know whether it's changing the rules of maternity leave and making it easier for parents from a financial point of view, for it not to be so stressful to raise their children, because finances are a big source of divorce, financial strain and trouble, as far as I know. Like, I would be leaning along those lines of saying, let's make laws to make these heterosexual couples who have brought children into the world stick together, come what may. Let's make it really, really easy for them to stick together and to bring their children up. Those are the laws that people need to be concerning themselves with passing. Those are the areas where you need to be creative and brainstorm things. Not these other laws that are actually not geared towards the common good. But what about heterosexual couples who adopt children? What about them? Why are we not counting them within this whole entire argument? There's a fundamental difference between heterosexual couples who adopt children and homosexual couples who adopt children. And it comes down to deliberate choice. Let me put it this way. When a heterosexual couple adopts a child, there is always some kind of external, extenuating circumstance that is kind of beyond their control. Something which they didn't directly will. So, for instance, it can be something like a relative who passes away and leaves behind some children who need to be looked after. Or there's a war-torn country next door and all the refugee orphan children pour into their own country and they feel compelled to look after some children. Or for some reason, they cannot have children, they cannot conceive for some reason, one or both of them. Something happens, like at the biological level, and they just cannot conceive children anymore, or it's psychological. There's always something that's kind of like beyond their direct volitional control, their direct willingness. But this is not that they cannot have children, and so they choose to adopt. So this is not the case with homosexual couples. So with homosexual couples, there's always an element of direct volitional choice. Now, am I saying that people choose to be homosexual? No. What I'm saying is that people do choose to act out the homosexuality. You see, no human being is compelled to act on their sexual attraction. And that's why it doesn't make sense to say this thing is a thing of human rights. Acting out on your sexual attraction is not a fundamental human right because you don't need it in order to survive. A human being needs food, clothing, shelter, to be with other human beings, right of association. These are things which they need, or even to believe in a higher power so that they can survive physically and psychologically. Human beings don't need to have sex to survive physically or psychologically. That's why sex can never be at the level of a fundamental human right. To choose who I want to have sex with is not a human right because sex is not needed for the survival of the individual. So people can experience same-sex attraction. They have no control over that. But whether they act on it, that's something that's fully within their control. Hence, I say that when it comes to homosexual couples deciding to adopt a child, this is fundamentally different from heterosexual couples deciding to adopt a child, because for the homosexual couples, a decision was made to take an action which would result in them deliberately never being able to conceive children. So it's almost kind of like, in a way similar to a heterosexual couple who says, listen, we are going to use contraception so that we can never ever conceive children, and then we're going to adopt. That is also something that would be a fundamentally flawed and sinful decision. So we've run out of time for this particular episode. In the next episode, we shall jump into the replies to the objections, paying close attention to objection 4 and 5. Objection 4 and 5 had to do with this idea that, hey, I'm not hurting anyone. So get out of my, why are you all up in my business? Like, don't tell me who I can have sex with or not. I'm not hurting anyone. We're two consenting adults. And then objection 5 is that whole idea of, I love God so much. I pray to God so much that, man, I'm sure he's going to forgive me in this particular area. So both of them have to do with love of God and love of neighbor, or charity. And that's what we shall discuss in the next episode.